W roku 1947
In 1947, the communist government in Warsaw decided to build a new city near Krakow.
że wybuduje tuż obok Krakowa nowe miasto.
The city would be called Nowa Huta, and it would be the first city in the communist bloc without God.
Pierwszym w obozie komunistycznym miastem bez Boga.
These were supposed to be secular socialist cities, in which there would be theatres, cinemas, cultural centres, but no churches.
Bardzo wielu młodych ludzi tam napłynęło do pracy, napłynęło głównie z większości z
Many young people went there to work. Most came from Polish villages.
Po całej Polsce, małych miasteczek. To byli ludzie wychowani w duchu.
These were people raised as Catholics, torn out of their familiar setting. In the beginning, they tasted this freedom, popular liberalism, everything that the authorities were promoting. In every corner there were many bars with vodka, shops with beer, and everyone was walking around drunk all the time. Boys would go around visiting girls, girls visited boys. There were many children born out of wedlock. There were ponds of burnt limestone because they were building using traditional methods. My friends who were workers said that every day they would pull wounded corpses out of these ponds. Different neighbourhoods fought, one workers' brigade against another, and over ridiculous things, that the brigade was making false reports on imposed working norms. It slowly occurred to these people that they were missing something, that they had grown up with some tradition, and that this tradition was being somehow marginalized, outlawed by the authorities. This provoked social discontent, but the people's discontent was repressed during the Stalinist terror. In 1956, as a result of the so-called Polish October, the process of de-Stalinization, some changes in the leadership of the Communist Party took place. The new first secretary became Władysław Gomułka, who faced great pressure from the grassroots level to change the official policy toward the church, which had become symbolized by the imprisonment of Cardinal Wyszynski in 1953. The Catholic Church in Poland was the strongest in Central and Eastern Europe. The process of attacking the church was therefore carried out progressively. From 1947, the authorities launched a hidden war to undermine the church, which became an open conflict by 1950, effected through arresting bishops and priests, removing religious education from schools, closing down Catholic institutions, newspapers, etc. The peak of these policies came in 1953 to 56, after Cardinal Wyszynski was arrested. Gomułka, obviously a communist, was pressured to ease his policies toward the church. When the people stopped being scared, they made demands for things. They said, "We want a church in Nowa Huta."
They began protesting, but they did it by sticking a cross into the earth of Nowa Huta. Several thousand people came, then tens of thousands. Gomułka came to power. People went to see him in Warsaw to ask him for permission to build a church. And he agreed, but only verbally. He didn't give any formal written confirmation.
Gomułka realized that liberalizing official policies toward the church would have to end.
Latem 1958 roku.
In the summer of 1958, when he decided that the social situation had calmed down enough for the policies against the church to become more strict, the first attack came.
Biskupów czy wyrzucania ich z diecezji, ale niemniej jednak na szeroką
They
skalę
used massive repressive measures, such as the repossession of property from people who allegedly failed to pay taxes, and removing religious education from schools.
Najpierw stwierdzono,
At first, they decided that the square, which had been designated for the church, was not suitable because its ownership was unclear. This was, of course, a typical bureaucratic excuse. But they also began to question whether the church building committee had the legal right to collect public contributions. This was especially disconcerting for the authorities as people began to organize themselves under the leadership of priests and independently of the authorities to build churches. This was a clear threat. Finally, at one point, 2 million zloty were confiscated from the bank account by the authorities. Finally, they announced that the committee to build the church was illegal and that it must disband. And then they decided to simply remove the cross and thus eliminate all possibilities for a church to be built in Nowa Huta.
przekreślić definitywnie szanse na budowę kościoła w Nowej Hucie.
Władze wynajęły tam kilkunastu robotników.
The authorities hired some workers. They were all drunk, and they started to remove the cross from the soil.
Najpierw kobiety, które tam
First, the women who were there all day and night praying at the cross stood in defense of that cross.
stanęły w obronie krzyża.
It became hectic, and there were loud cries. Others came running in, the women's husbands and workers from the factory.
Z kombinatu.
At the same time, thousands of military cars drove onto the street, surrounding the city so that no one could enter, and the fighting began.
I rozpoczęła się walka.
When I came back from school, I was 10 years old then, I found out from my sister that our mum was on the church square, that there were some problems with the cross. I left my books at the house and went to meet my mum.
It hit us like this. It was dark and a strange smell spread around, and then our eyes began to run immediately, tear gas. So everyone began to wipe their eyes and we heard shots. And right after the shots, you could hear singing in the distance.
We were singing, "We want God in our books, schools and families."
Beloved Mother, then, God who defended Poland. And I said, let's go toward the singing. The number of wounded after these confrontations reached several hundreds. Some later became sick and died from their wounds. In the 20th century, I don't know if there was such an incident when workers of a socialist state stood in opposition to the authorities in defense of a cross.
W obronie tych ludzi stanął biskup pomocniczy.
In defense of these people stood the auxiliary bishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła.
Do mieszkańców
He called for the residents of Nowa Huta to calm down, to cease fighting, that he would begin talks with the authorities.
Rozmawiać z władzami.
Skończyło się na pewnym kompromisie.
It ended with a certain compromise. The clergy in Krakow's curia replaced the administrative representative of Nowa Huta, Father Satora, with a new priest, Father Gorzelany, who turned out to be very pragmatic and flexible. And through various behind-the-scenes negotiations, he was able to gain a new permission for building a church in a different location, but in Nowa Huta.
Nową zgodę na budowę kościoła w innym miejscu, ale w Nowej Hucie.
Był rok 1965.
It was in 1965. The Holy Father, Paul VI, invited Cardinal Wojtyła and myself for an audience.
Kazał wpierw jeszcze
He asked to bring a stone from the grave of St. Peter, which he laid on my hands, saying, "Take this stone to Poland and build a church on it in Nowa Huta."
i wybuduj na nim kościół w Nowej Hucie.
I brought the stone to the Christmas midnight mass, which was always held in the open air and was attended by over 20,000 people. Midnight mass begins with the hymn, God is born. And then the workers of Nowa Huta began yelling, the power trembles, the power trembles, the power trembles. They were screaming so loudly, it lasted for several minutes. The cardinal was sitting on a throne behind the altar. He stood up, raised his hand to quieten them, and said, the power trembles. In Nowa Huta, the church will stand here. From the very beginning, I had the thought that it should be an ark. It had to be a boat because Nowa Huta had become a sea of red. And I told Cardinal Wojtyła, we have to build a boat in the middle of this Red Sea. They finally granted permission not to build a church, but to enlarge the existing chapel. It was this little courtyard where nuns lived and took care of the children, and inside there was a small chapel. I immediately put a temporary altar on the outside wall of the courtyard, and from that day, all masses were held there in the open air.
It didn't matter whether it was freezing or pouring rain or whatever. If it wasn't an umbrella, it was a winter coat. We wore gloves and even hats if we had to. But I admired those priests who held liturgies and holy masses. When I looked at their hands, they were red like beets. They were shaking from the cold, but they celebrated the masses.
In 1967, Cardinal Wojtyła came, celebrated Mass, stepped away from the altar, took a pickaxe in his hand, and for the first time struck the earth of Nowa Huta. I did it after him, and after me all the other priests. Then other people came up and began to dig the space for the foundations of the church. And the communists said, you'll never build a church anyway. Even if you have permission, you still need to confirm the project, obtain the building materials. And they announced this. They went to every part of Krakow and outside of Krakow. That is, it's illegal to sell anything to priest Gorzelany. Not even a single brick, or a bit of cement, or steel. Nothing. Indeed, the work went on day and night. After working in the factories, all these thousands of people went to build the church. The people dug the space for the foundations with their own hands.
Were you working at your normal job this morning? Yes, I work on a shift there and come here afterwards. Do you do that every day? Yes, nearly every day. And how long has that been going on? About 4 years. I do this without payment. It's an honorary job. In what sense honorary? For the church or for the state? For the church, of course. I'm a believer, and we're building our church here.
There were thousands of such volunteers. People were coming to help with support work by removing wooden planks, removing nails, mixing cement and transporting materials. I also helped in the work. So you can most definitely say that the church was built with bare hands and the help of wheelbarrows. When we got the message that the sand had been delivered, that cars were going to be delivering sand, then people would gather and come. Cars delivered it here, and we carried it there.
Masses of people would come and help so that there would be a church.
Był jakiś taki
There was this great determination among the people. I only saw it once in my life. I kept telling people every day, this church is being built by the Mother of God, and we are just helping her.
A my jej tylko pomagamy. Głosiłem ludziom, żeby każdy przyniósł kamyk.
I announced that every person should bring a stone, because the stone that you offer will be your signature on the wall of the church, as if you had put your surname on it. And what happened then? People began to bring whole bags of stones.
Ludzie przywozili całe paki tego kamienia.
People gave 10% of their monthly salaries to the building of the church.
To, co ludzie dali,
What people donated here in Poland was hardly enough to pay the workers and to give them insurance.
na zapłacenie robotników i ich
But all the building materials came from the West.
wszystkie materiały przychodziły z
The steel was produced in Poland, but bought with their money.
ale kupowana za pieniądze
The dollar
ich.
saved us.
Ratunkiem był dolar.
All the donations from people in the West that were collected for the building of the church were collected by aid to the church in need.
Incredible difficulties had to be overcome, but we were able to help. For without financial help from abroad, the allocation of certain building materials and the use of technical means of construction would have been unthinkable.
It was powerful help, and I have to say that it was a sign of the people's faith.
Znak wiary. Budowa trwała 10 lat.
The building of the church lasted 10 years because we faced incredible difficulties. When we dug out the space for the foundations and filled it, the committee came to check the work. They knocked on everything, measured everything. Everyone was constantly called in for questioning. Every day, people from the security office would come to the building site. They would join the ranks of the workers, and in different ways to recruit them to inform on everything. They had many different ways. Many, many.
To było masy. Właściwie najlepszą radę mi dał
The best advice I received was really from Cardinal Wyszynski. Whatever they do to you, never talk about it publicly, because then it will be the end of you. They were themselves surprised. Why didn't we hear the priest talk about it at the pulpit, that he was interrogated here? I would say, it's of so little importance. I speak the word of God, and what you do to me, you're very welcome. I'm at your disposal. It saved me, though, and to this day I pray for Cardinal Wyszynski, because he prepared me well.
The church was consecrated by Cardinal Wojtyła on the 15th of May 1977. There was literally a sea of people.
Padał gęsty deszcz.
It was pouring with rain, and despite that, over 70,000 people came. All the embassies in Poland sent their representatives for the ceremony. Different delegations came from abroad.
Kardynał Wojtyła przyjechał
Cardinal Wojtyła came to consecrate the church.
za rok.
1 year later, he became the
Został
Pope.
papieżem. Ojciec Święty pierwszym
The Holy Father made the first pilgrimage to Poland in 1979, and he especially wanted to go to Nowa Huta.
jechać do Nowej Huty. Komuniści
The communists said very firmly that absolutely they could not allow him to go to the Church of the Ark in Nowa Huta.
żeby był w kościele Arki w Nowej Hucie. No to
So the episcopate negotiated that he could go to the Cistercian monastery on the outskirts of Nowa Huta.
na końcu Nowej Huty. I tam wygłosił
There,
potężne
the Holy
kazanie
Father gave a powerful sermon,
i wspomniał tam,
and he reminded us at what price
za
that
jaką
church
cenę
had been
ten
built.
kościół był zbudowany.
Nie można oddzielić krzyża.
You cannot separate the cross from human labour.
Nie można oddzielić Chrystusa.
You cannot separate Christ from human labour.
Właśnie potwierdziło się tutaj
This was proven here in Nowa Huta.
hutnicy. To oni
Metal workers. It was they who brought with them this new cross.
nowy krzyż. To oni go
It
postawili.
was they who put it up as a sign that they were going to build a new church.
Będą budować nowy kościół.
Dla Karola Wojtyły, jak się
For Karol
wydaje,
Wojtyła, it seems that Nowa Huta was one of the most important training grounds for the fight over the place of the church in Poland, or maybe even more broadly, in all of Central and Eastern Europe that was governed by communists.
w latach 80., kiedy
In the 1980s, when Poland was in the state of martial law,
to miejsce było dość
this place was a natural place of gathering for supporters of Solidarność in order to protest. It became the central place of the battle for freedom, not only religious freedom, but freedom in general.
Jak przyszedł stan wojenny ogłoszony przez
When Jaruzelski declared martial law, they began to wage war against the Holy Mother of Fatima
Matką Boską
because they said that the Holy Mother was anti-communist,
Bo oni mówili, że ta Matka Boska jest antykomunistyczna.
and there the Marial service is held every 13th of the month from May to October.
Od maja do października.
Every time, over 20,000 people took part in the services.
Razem ponad 20 000 ludzi.
The communists would surround the church.
Stawiali kościół
Hundreds of cars would show up with the militia,
aut wtedy
with the so-called ormo,
przyjeżdżało
armed.
z milicją, z tak zwanym ormo.
They shot bullets into the church,
Strzelali pociskami w kościół.
and they even ran into the
Nawet
church and dropped
wpadli
tear
do
gas.
kościoła wewnątrz.
The gas was so strong that no one was able to bear it.
Ten gaz był tak
The people,
żrący, że
instead of
nikt nie
praying from the
potrafił
prayer book,
wytrzymać.
would cry.
Ludzie zamiast z książeczek modlić się płakali. Figurę Matki Boskiej zawsześmy stawiali na zewnątrz.
The figure of the Virgin Mary was always placed outside the church,
13 marca w 1000
and one time on the 13th of March in 1982, they began shooting at that figure.
tej figury. Do dzisiaj mam zachowane
To this day,
7
I have saved the 7 bullets that fell at the feet of the Virgin Mary.
i leżały u stóp Matki Bożej.
Wszystkie petardy, które zostały...
All of the bullets that were fired at the figure fell to the feet of the Holy Virgin Mary. None of them exploded. In hindsight, it's difficult to even imagine it, that this city lived through such a nightmare.
It is just plain unbelievable that such things happened in Poland.
Palące się normalnie samochody.
Burning cars, those military cars,
Bojowe
which were used to attack and pour water on people.
Atakowali i lali ludzi.
And it wasn't have mercy on us, they just beat us and knocked us down. Very often, even children were beaten. They shot the Wawosik, shot him over there in front of the church. That young man.
On that side, there is a statue of Bogdan Wawosik at the place where he died. That ZOMO unit stayed until maybe 1990, or maybe 1991. I remember when it left. They had military tanks, it's true. They had a tank, etc. And of course they had plenty of rifles. But we weren't doing anything wrong. We were just praying. And even though there was almost no chance, there was no hope that a church would stand here, the church was finally built, and the whole world comes to it.
I came to Poland about 19 years ago for the first time, and in a suitcase brought in books for Catholics, and came to Kracow and went to Zakopane. And this time to be back and see the church resurrected and freer to proclaim the gospel is absolutely fantastic. And to stand here in front of the church in Nowa Huta, which is almost a symbol of the resurrection and of the hope which was built on the faith of the people of Poland, is fantastic.
This history of the church in Nowa Huta is incredibly important is that it contains, in a nutshell, the whole history of the relationship between the state and the church in communist Poland. Churches that you built with such effort and also such enthusiasm, which you undertook and continue to undertake, are all created so that through them and with them, the gospel of Jesus Christ can enter in your entire lives. The cross endures, though the world changes.
Pomóż nam, przecież się Kościół w Nowej Hucie nie zbuduje sam. Do nas przyjdź jeszcze zaraz dziś, by zwyciężył w Nowej Hucie Chrystus za krzyż. Do nas przyjdź, pomóż nam, przecież się Kościół w Nowej Hucie nie zbuduje sam. Do nas przyjdź jeszcze zaraz dziś, by zwyciężył w Nowej Hucie Chrystus za krzyż. Do nas przyjdź, pomóż nam, przecież się Kościół w Hucie nie zbuduje sam. Do nas przyjdź jeszcze zaraz dziś, by zwyciężył w Nowej Hucie Chrystus za krzyż. Do nas przyjdź jeszcze zaraz dziś, by zwyciężył w Nowej Hucie Chrystus za krzyż.